Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Half our congregation just walked out the back door.
Good sign.
Yes. Yeah, by the way, we have had, just before I launch into this message, we've got some really amazing things going on in our youth programs in general, but there's been a recent wave of excitement sweeping through some of our high schoolers. Some pretty dramatic stuff that God is doing. It's a revival. I don't know if you know this, but the Welsh revival, which was massive and reached millions and millions of people, was started by a young girl who was sitting at a youth meeting, just declared her excitement for Christ, something to the effect of, oh, how I do love Jesus, and I just want to live my life for him, something to that effect. She got all the teenagers around her excited about the Lord, and pretty soon it spread like wildfire, and there was a reviving in the church that went way beyond the Welsh people. It's really quite incredible when you read that history. And so I think about that when I see God getting a hold of some of our young people, and we see just the dramatic change that's occurring, the excitement that's there, and I hope to get some testimonials in here soon that will encourage you as an adult to see that next generation. Well, we're in 1 Peter 5. This is page 1036 if you're using the church Bible. We're coming into home stretch. We're going to take half of the last chapter, so really just one or two more messages left on this. We've titled this series, Resilient Living in a Hostile World. So we're jumping into chapter 5 this morning. We're going to take verses 1 to 7. Let's read this. Therefore, I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, acting to the will of God, or according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. When the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. You younger men, likewise, be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, for God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Well, there's a lot in those verses this morning. I'll do my best to hit the main points, but you notice in verse 1 that it starts with the word therefore. And as I said before, when you see that word therefore, you've got to find out what it's there for. Why is that word used here? Well, it's a continuation. He's essentially connecting what he says here in chapter 5 to what has gone before. What is the theme that we've been dealing with? So we've got a slightly different subject, but the theme remains the same. The theme, of course, in 1 Peter is suffering. Peter addresses the subject of suffering 21 times in this short epistle. In order to make this connection between chapter 5 and what went before it, I think there's a couple of key verses that we can use to find what that connection is. Let's go back to chapter 4 for a moment, verse 12. We saw this last week. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal among you, which comes upon you for your testing, as though some strange thing had happened to you. That very well could be an elaboration of chapter 1, verse 7, where he talks about, well, in verse 6, that you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little season, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so you have this idea of a fiery trial. Chapter 1, verse 7 tells us that the trials that we endure, like the crucible, which are meant to purify us, they test our faith, they test our character, and they refine it. We saw this also in the chapter last time, chapter 4, verse 17, where it says, it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. It's time for the judgment to begin at the household of God. And this showing, again, why God often allows trials and tribulations to come into the church. That God is looking for the purification value of those tests and trials. And so in many ways, we as God's people, we may have more trials than the world around us. I shared Psalm 73 last time, the Psalm of Asaph, where he made that observation that the wicked seem to have it better than the righteous, and he couldn't understand it. But there's a reason that God allows suffering. He allows the fiery trial. It's very fitting when you're talking about judgment beginning in the household of God that he now turns his attention to the leadership of the church, to the elders, and he has a word of encouragement for them. Now, leadership in a church needs to understand the fires perhaps better than anyone else, how to endure the fires. We're the ones that will help others get through. When I was up in Alaska, my second year there, for the summer, I had my eyes set on a job that I thought would be the coolest job in the world, which was to be a hot shot. You know what hot shots are with the fires? They're kind of the front linesmen of the fires. I thought, man, that'll be an exciting adventure. And my buddy's dad, he's the one who ran the program locally, and he said, yeah, my dad can get you in, man. I was a shoo-in, except for the fact that I had jacked up my ankle playing soccer and I couldn't run. And one of the qualifications to becoming a hot shot, you had to run 5 miles or something, and then they do that every day to keep themselves in good shape. So I couldn't, unfortunately, be a hot shot. But that idea of being on the front lines, being where the heat is the most intense, it really, I never got to be a hot shot, but in some ways I got to feel what it's like to be on the front lines, because leadership in the church is very much like that. When it comes to the fiery trials, we're kind of the front linesmen. We're going to feel the heat perhaps more than anyone. And so Peter is encouraging the leadership of the church in the midst of sufferings and trials. And while he points them in verse 4 to the fact that there's a day of compensation coming when the chief shepherd arrives, and that's when we get our reward, he doesn't pull any punches here. He delivers the criteria that is required for leadership in order to effectively lead others into and through the fiery trials of life. And one of the challenges is pastors, leaders in a church, when things are happening in the world and people are suffering, guess what? They're suffering too. Just the same as everyone else. They're feeling the heat. And some of the specific trials of leadership can be inferred from the passages that we're going to be looking at today. We see the outcome of the testing and the temptations that face the pastors, and that some, through trial and hardship, fall into kind of a compulsory stagnation, where they do what they do out of a sense of obligation. That they're just going through the motions of pastoring a church or being leaders in a church. That can happen. People lose heart in the midst of trials. So he warns against that. It's also inferred by the temptation with money. He talks about not doing it for gain. And then there's also even this possibility that there could be an abuse of power, and those in leadership could become kind of overlords in the church, lording it over the flock. And that does happen sometimes. And so there's this word of exhortation. It's a heavy word, but it's very important. So I'm going to have my finger pointed at myself this morning, kind of preaching to myself, to our leadership, and the rest of you don't get too comfortable, because when we get to verses 5 to 7, I'm going to include you in that challenge as well. So we're just going to look at 3 things this morning, 3 different individuals that are being targeted. You have the elders, and then in verse 5 we're going to see the youngers, and then verse 5b and following, it's all of you is who he addresses, so everyone else. So in verse 1, therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, not for sordid gain, but with eagerness. I'll pause there for a moment. Let me ask you a question. What is an elder? Well, I guess you could have a number of answers to that question. The very word elder brings to mind age, right? Because we call some of the older ones perhaps the elderly. And so when you see the word elder, you immediately think old person. Okay? And we're going to see there's more to it than that. I will say that the background of this word that is used in the New Testament really comes out of the influence of the Old Testament. You know, Israel as a nation, they were accustomed to having elders, right? So you had Moses and the 70 elders back in Exodus. And those elders were the leadership that were chosen to help to bring order to the nation at that time, to be spiritual shepherds as well. As far as the qualifications to be an elder and what we're talking about here, we're talking about the office of elder. So we're not just talking about older people, we're talking about people who have been given a calling by God in order to have leadership responsibilities in the church. Now, what are the qualifications for eldership? Well, it has more to do with maturity and wisdom than it does with age. So there's exceptions to the elders being elderly rule, right? Timothy was a good example. He was a young man who was called to leadership earlier than most. But why was that? Because he had an upbringing, right? In things of the Lord, his mother, his grandmother. I was actually an elder at age 25. And by that point in my Christian life, I had about 10 years of ministry experience. And even though I was young, and I'd been an elder in training for 2 years leading up to that, so even though I was young, there was some experience there. Now is it preferable to have an elder who's 25 years old? Well, probably not. But the point is that it does happen. My point that I'm making is that the calling to eldership doesn't necessarily correlate with age. Again, it's focused on maturity and wisdom. But having said that, isn't it obvious that a person who's older in the Lord will they will have more life experience. They'll have more maturity and wisdom if they're doing the Christian life as they're supposed to. So typically we do have older people who would be elders in a church. But I want you to notice some things. We're identifying this group of individuals of leadership that God has called. But I want you to know some important words, and this is really setting the stage here. I exhort the elders among you. And why are the words among you so important? Well, because in a moment he's going to address those who lord over the flock. So he's addressing the elders not who are over you, but the elders who are among you. And then to further emphasize the importance of this, look at what he says about himself. As your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. There's a certain humility in Peter's approach, because Peter could have pulled the apostleship card, right? He could have said, hey, as an apostle, as one who has authority over you, I'm exhorting you to do this. But he doesn't. He says, as your fellow elder. He's identifying here with these other elders, and the qualifications he gives for being able to address them is the witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as the glory that's to be revealed. Now, I don't know what the glory that is to be revealed is referencing. It could have been that Peter was talking about the transfiguration, where he got a glimpse of future glory when he saw the radiant glory of Christ coming through for just a moment. I'm not sure exactly, but he was a man who was qualified because he had a relationship with the Lord. And this is pointed out in John chapter 21. Whatever these reference, Peter had a great grasp of suffering and glory. These themes go hand in hand. You often find them together in the New Testament. Suffering and glory. But let's look for a moment at Peter's call. Because Peter had failed Christ grievously, and now you have Christ in his resurrected body. He's restoring Peter, and he's commissioning Peter. And this is John chapter 21, verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he says, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said to Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And he said, take care of my sheep. And of course, there was a third time he said it as well. Feed my sheep. There he is commissioned as an elder/pastor. We have an instance of Paul being called to this work as well. Says, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. And after fasting and praying, they laid hands on them and sent them off. Now, what do you have in common with those two individuals being brought into ministry? Both Peter and Paul. You have the fact that they were called by who?
Jesus.
They were called, yes, by the Lord himself. And so what you have there in Acts chapter 13 is the Spirit of God leading the group to say, these individuals have been chosen for the work of the Lord, and they sanctified, consecrated them, and sent them off with their blessing. And that's how it's supposed to work with eldership, right? So you have, eldership itself is a God-appointed task. I believe that God calls people to be elders. I believe that is it's something he gifts individuals for. And it's really about God's appointment, and then the church being in agreement with God that, yes, this person here has that appointment from God. That's our responsibility. So there is a appointing that happens in the church, like Acts 14. When they had ordained them elders in every church and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. And so there is a human sense in which there's an appointing, but again, that appointing is merely an acknowledgement that God has given these individuals a calling. Now in 1 Timothy chapter 3, I don't have the time to go into all this, but you have the qualifications to become an elder.